Is Canada on the list? That's the question everybody's asking. You know, the United States has grabbed Venezuela. They're openly talking about taking Greenland. They're threatening Mexico, Panama, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Colombia. So is Canada on the list? Well, the answer is Canada probably is on the list. The current geopolitical situation is a little bit terrifying. But there is some good news. One significant factor that is probably going to work in our favor. Stick with me and I'll explain what that is and why. I'm Steve Sandford. You're watching Dominion Report. Let's just review to set the stage for this conversation. Going back to the early days of this Trump administration, and who can imagine it was only 1 year ago that this started, Trump was already talking about Canada as the 51st state. And he was at that time talking about Greenland and Panama. Panama, of course, includes the Panama Canal. Now, back then, it sounded to me like the start of a full continental grab. Greenland, Canada, Panama. There's only, I think, Mexico and one other country down there. I forget which. Nicaragua. There were many Canadians and also Americans who brushed it all off as a joke. You know, just Trump being Trump. I personally was not one of them. Trump says crazy stuff all the time, and it's usually a trial balloon, and he kind of throws it out there to see what the reaction is. Often when he gets pushback, and by the way, on 51st State, he did get pushback from Mark Carney. Not everyone knows this. When Carney became prime minister, he did not call the president initially, and that's quite unusual for a prime minister. Carney instead went to meet leaders in Europe and the UK, and his office sent word to Trump's office, informing him that he wouldn't actually speak to him until the 51st State comments stopped, which they did, at least for a while anyway. So as I was saying, Trump floats crazy ideas and he puts them aside when he gets pushback, but very often he comes back to them at a later date. So in the last year, what has the administration actually done, militarily speaking? Well, let's set aside the hurling of bombs just for a minute. That's, Iran and Nigeria and Somalia and Syria and Yemen and Iraq. And of course, Venezuela as well, but Venezuela grew into Trump's most profound military adventurism hobby. So you'll remember that it began with boat strikes. It was the murdering of supposed drug traffickers, without due process. And then it moved to grabbing Venezuelan oil tanker. And that, of course, turned the U.S. Navy into literal pirates of the Caribbean. Then, about a week ago, the Trump administration utilized the U.S. military to kidnap Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife and remove them from the country. Although they removed him, they have so far retained the existing Maduro administration. So they swore in Delcy Rodriguez, that's Maduro's vice president, as the new acting president. So they left the entire existing corrupt regime in place. I have a friend who's a Canadian and U.S. dual citizen. I think he's U.S. He spent a lot of time working in the States at any rate. And he's pretty conservative, and we have debates fairly regularly. And we disagree on many things. Our debates are respectful and they're healthy political discourse. But that person, if you're watching, if they're watching right now, they know who they are. If you're like that person, that friend of mine, and you shared social media posts cheering the murder of so-called narco-terrorists in small boats with no due process because fentanyl, you got played. And if you believed it was about cocaine, you got played. And if you believed it was about regime change or installing democracy or getting rid of the evil dictator's administration, you got played. We knew it was oil. We knew all along. All of those things were the weapons of mass destruction justification of Venezuela. And for the younger viewers, WMDs were the fabricated justification for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And of course, the removal of Saddam Hussein, which makes it sound really familiar. Because right from the very beginning, we all knew that back even in the first small boat bombing, we all knew that it was about oil. And even more than just oil, about the petrodollar. And I actually have a whole video explaining that portion I'll put a link below to that. Now, at this point, they're not even hiding it. Trump is just openly talking about the oil, U.S. oil interests and U.S. oil corporations. And he's even claimed that Venezuela is now giving 50 million barrels of oil to the U.S. It'll be care of Trump himself, of course, I suppose, for safekeeping. So Trump at this point is probably feeling pretty emboldened, and he likely thinks that he now runs Venezuela and that achieving that was super easy. Put a pin in that thought because we're going to circle back to it. So after Venezuela, it would appear Greenland is next in his sights. In fact, Katie Miller, who is the wife of Joseph Goebbels wannabe Stephen Miller, made a post on Elon Musk's personal grievance social media site depicting this image. This is a picture of Greenland. It's adorned in a U.S. flag, and she just added the single word, soon. Now, just for the record, Stephen Miller is Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House. He's in charge of Trump's immigration policies. That includes ICE. And he reportedly creeps out everybody he meets, which isn't surprising if you've ever seen him in interview. And which, by the way, he was interviewed quite recently, just a few days ago, by Jake Tapper on CNN. And I don't know if any of you all saw it, but all I can say is it was unhinged. Like, he was bombastic and aggressive and verbally combative and borderline verbally abusive. And he outright said that the United States blatantly just should have control of Greenland. And when asked if he would rule out military action, he claimed that no country would fight against the U.S. over Greenland. Now, as for Katie Miller, she's held various positions in both Trump administrations and also spent time working for Elon Musk. Trump himself has since confirmed the desire to take Greenland, including the option to use military force as a possibility. Now, Greenland is a territory of Denmark, which, of course, is a NATO ally. And so if the U.S. attacks a fellow NATO ally member, then either the U.S. will be removed from NATO or perhaps NATO will cease to exist. Let's just acknowledge that NATO has been the most successful and the most powerful military alliance in history. And it's been a key backbone of the rules-based international order, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. Now, the end of NATO would pretty much be Vladimir Putin's wet dream. And I'm going to say that most people actually probably understand that. Most people probably don't understand that the end of NATO would also signal a sudden and dramatic end to the United States as a superpower. Now, that's a whole discussion that would probably warrant an entire separate video, so I'm not going to get into it here, but it's pretty key, and I don't think Trump fully understands that. And let me also add this to the discussion. Fiona Hill is a Washington political advisor with a long and fairly impressive resume. She worked in the W. Bush administration. She worked in the Obama administration. In the early days of Trump's first administration, she was senior director for Russian affairs at the National Security Council. Now, in 2019, that's a couple years later, she testified before Congress, under oath of course, that the Russians had signaled to the Trump administration a willingness to reduce support for Maduro and for Venezuela in exchange for U.S. restraint in the defense of Ukraine. This, of course, was all before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, what was that Latin term again? I mean, you know the one? It's the one that means I give you a quid and you pro me a quo. And with that, let's just recall how much Trump withdrew U.S. support for Ukraine since taking over from Biden and then invaded Venezuela. Now, side note here, it sounds like Trump and his administration probably knew all along that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, and Trump still blames Biden for it. At any rate, beyond the military adventurism in Venezuela, Trump has just recently announced that he plans to make land strikes in Mexico, claiming that he wants to target drug cartels. Now, if you feel so inclined, give this video a pause right here and let me know in the comments below if you think that drugs are the real reason Trump would consider bombing Mexico. In another unhinged WTF moment, the U.S. Department of State made a social media post with this image. This suggests that Trump intends to take control of the entirety of North and South America. Now, this wasn't posted by a MAGA basement dweller or a Russian troll farm. This wasn't even the Federalist Society or the Heritage Foundation. This was the freaking U.S. State Department. At any rate, whether it's a complete hemispherical control that they're looking for, or they're just targeting natural resource countries, Canada can consider itself a prime target. And if the US and Russia and China have secretly got together and carved up the world into 3 regions, the future of Canada, and probably actually, quite frankly, the future of humanity, doesn't look all that rosy right now. Which just brings us back to that concept I mentioned before. That's the one of rules-based international order. Now, I'm going to do the briefest of overviews here. But I came across a small independent YouTuber who has actually a really great explainer on it. And I'm going to put the link below, and I'm going to encourage you to go watch it. So, as brief as I can. After World War II, the Western powers sat down together to discuss how the world would unfold going forward. They were looking at the past several hundred years of wars, and that, of course, included most recently World War II, and right before that, World War I. And they were looking at how military technology evolved dramatically to make wars exponentially more devastating and more expensive. World War II showed that war had evolved beyond just the geographic confines of the battlefield area. Suddenly, war was gutting entire cities and killing off citizens and destroying infrastructure. And let's not forget that World War II ended with the deployment of nuclear weapons. So they knew what would happen should there be another war, and they knew that technology would continue to evolve. So what they did is they developed an agreement to promote trade, to promote resource sharing, and to allow countries to specialize on the world market based on what resources were available to them and what they were good at, and to trade that for the items that they didn't have. So, hey, we've got oil reserves. We're really good at pulling out of the ground. Let's do that, and we'll sell it on the world market. And that country over there is really good at growing food. So let's use the money we got from the oil and put it into our economy so our citizens can buy food from that country. Makes sense, right? They basically decided to compete with trade and commerce instead of with war. And they also agreed to respect other countries' sovereignty and allow other countries to establish their own style of government, either by democratic means or sometimes by internal civil unrest. Now, this agreement, this rules-based international order, was mostly, not fully, but mostly followed by Western countries, and this led to the most prosperous and the most peaceful time in the entirety of human history. And that has just taken place over the past 80 years. Invading Venezuela threatens that rules-based international order. Invading Greenland, pitting NATO country against NATO country, would pretty much discard it entirely. Without the rules-based international order, large countries will again return to empire building. Trade and commerce will be slashed. Countries will withdraw into themselves, and most of the world will end up in poverty and hunger and violence. In the short term, as alliances are undone and countries prioritize their own defense, Ukraine will probably fall to Russia, and Taiwan will fall to China, and the US will continue with its plans for Venezuela or Greenland or Mexico or Canada or whatever it is that they're doing. Again, I encourage you to watch the rules-based international order video I link below. I don't have any skin in that game. I don't even know that guy personally, but I just found his explainer really well done. Now, that all said, I promised you that I would share something that should give us Canadians some hope. So let's get to that part. Earlier I said Trump probably feels pretty pleased with his operation in Venezuela. And that's because he's at the mission accomplished phase of the operation. The only thing missing is the big banner across the bridge of the aircraft carrier. He doesn't realize that the difficult part of empire building is actually just beginning. And his team, you know, the Department of Defense and the State Department, et cetera, they're all led by what can only be described as incompetent, ideologically driven morons. I'm just going to say this right out loud. There is no scenario where Venezuela goes well for them. In fact, Trump has already struck out with the oil companies. He met with the leaders of the oil companies a few days ago, and they told him to his face that Venezuela is uninvestable. And that's for all the reasons that I discussed in my previous video, the one that explored how all of this Venezuela situation will impact Alberta's oil industry. And I'll put a link to that video as well below. Now, the scenario down there is going to get worse. With Maduro gone, there's somewhat of a power vacuum. Yes, Delcy Rodriguez is now acting president, but she has already denounced Trump's recent executive order. That was one that he signed protecting Venezuela's oil reserves, among other things, by blocking seizure of the oil by Venezuelan courts and by other creditors. Now, Rodriguez called that action illegitimate and aggressive and accused Washington of undermining Venezuelan sovereignty and targeting its oil. I mean, duh. Why else are they there? One wonders how long before Rodriguez is removed by the U.S. and perhaps joins Maduro in the U.S. jail system. Also part of this whole equation is Maria Corina Machado. Now, she's leader of the opposition. Now, she was legally barred from participating in the most recent Venezuelan election, barred by Maduro, of course. But a stand-in who represented her party is widely thought to have gained 70% of the vote last time at the polls. Now, Maduro, who controlled the election and the counting of ballots, he claimed to be the winner when he retained power. It's almost like the existing president of a country shouldn't be involved in how elections are managed. Hashtag just saying. Now, Trump is not really a super fan of Machado, possibly because she won the Nobel Peace Prize, the one that Trump claimed was owed to him. Machado herself actually presents as a bit of a Trump supporter. Now, when she received her Nobel Prize, she dedicated it to Trump. And just this week, she's actually offered to give it to Trump, even though the Nobel Institute has pretty much stated that that isn't how it works. She's scheduled to meet with Trump in the coming few days, so actually we're going to find out if she gets to trade her Nobel Prize medal for a presidential position in Venezuela. Because that's exactly how one would think a country's leadership position should be legitimately earned. Not to mention how a peace prize should be legitimately earned. Friends, this is a very weird timeline that we're all stuck in. Now, there's a whole bunch of there's a number of non-state actors in Venezuela as well. And if any of those groups were inclined to try for a power grab, they might be thinking that this is the time. And plus, in case anyone was wondering, citizens don't really enjoy it when a foreign country takes over, extracts and sells their natural resources, and keeps the money for themselves, especially citizens who are poor and hungry. What I'm trying to say with all of this is that the situation in Venezuela is messy. It's dynamic. It's likely to change many, many times in the near and mid-term future. And frankly, it's probably going to be messy for decades. For Trump to maintain control of the oil fields, there is moderate to high chance that he's going to need a military occupation. Maybe even a full military occupation like Iraq style. And with that in mind, I want to talk military occupation and specifically the number of troops a country needs to maintain control of another occupied country. Now, there's a whole bunch of variables in that calculation, but there is a commonly accepted average, and it's 20 troops per 1,000 population. It can be much higher than that, especially if there's an insurgent combative population to control. For example, when the Russians occupied Chechnya, they didn't have 20, they had 150 per 1,000. Another example may be a hypothetical scenario. You'd probably need more than 20 if you were to, say, occupy a country and, take their oil. And whatever number of fighting force military personnel you have, you need to double that to account for the non-fighting force. That's the logistics. That's the engineers and mechanics and the translators and so on. So let's do some math together. Venezuela has about 30 million people. So if it becomes super unstable for U.S. oil interests, which I have to believe is quite likely, and they need a full They need a full control of the country. Based on the population size alone, the U.S. could potentially need to put 600,000 troops on the ground. That means probably over 1 million, including support staff. And unlike Iraq, the U.S. military would be doing this on their own. Now, how many troops does the U.S. have in total? Well, the number of active duty is about 1.3 million, and there's about 700,000 reserves. But less than half of those would be considered fighting force, and a sizable number would be in the Navy, so probably not part of any boots on the ground occupation activities. Without getting any further into the detailed minutiae of the numbers, there's so many variables it could change, a good chunk either way. We can see that no matter how you run the numbers, a very sizable portion of the U.S. military could potentially be required to occupy Venezuela. And that there is super key. Now, if you recall back in the beginning of the video, I said that Canada was probably on the list, but probably further down the list. Venezuela was clearly first on the list, but all those countries on the list above Canada means that there is potential for the U.S. to consume more sizable chunks of their military with actions that they may take in those countries. Now, a side note here, speaking of using up all their military, Trump recently stated he wants to increase the U.S. military budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion by 2027. That's a staggering number, but I just want to say I'm sure it's not related to anything we've been talking about here, right? I mean, of course it is. Trump probably doesn't realize that money does not equal instant troops. You can't just throw extra money and that same year increase your fighting force by 50%. It takes years to enlist and train people and to build associated military infrastructures and to increase the capacity for deployment in occupied countries. The military is not like ICE, who hires anybody with no background checks, including Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and J6ers, and gives them about 5 minutes of training, gives them a gun, a badge, and a face mask, and lets them loose on the general public. But I digress. Now, we have a bit more to cover, but if you're finding this analysis useful, please consider subscribing to the channel. Bringing this back to military adventurism, all of this conversation should be regarded in the context of Trump's and MAGA's longevity, because Trump is old and he's not in good health. I personally will be surprised if he actually makes it to the end of this term. And because Trump is Trump, he will not accept that anyone will take over from him. Malignant narcissism, sociopathy, and paranoia, all of those exaggerated by progressive prefrontal dementia, means that he's psychologically incapable of imagining that anybody could replace him. So there is zero succession planning happening. Further, he'll likely sabotage, maybe even scorched earth, anyone who looks like they're maneuvering to replace him. And MAGA itself, it is a cult of personality. I just don't see it surviving beyond the personality of Trump. All of this is my way of saying, again, here in Canada, we have some hope. The chances that Venezuela goes pear-shaped is high. Even if it doesn't, one of the other countries that he could potentially evade could go pear-shaped itself. Military capacity will be consumed, and all of this is measured against the ticking clock of inevitability. Let me stress, none of that is a guarantee. We still need to prepare. Trump is wildly unpredictable, and progressive dementia means that his unpredictability is only increasing. I'm just going to share that this here is the very issue that caused me to start this channel. I thought, going back as far as Trump's re-election, that was November of 2024, I thought that this was an existential threat that Canada might be facing and that we needed to be talking about it. I'm rather sad that it's looking more and more like I was correct. And I'm still hoping that I'm not. On the topic of this channel, just a quick note. I actually love what we built here. Your viewership, your comments all contribute to the community that we've developed. To make these videos, I do it all on my own. And I do it while also maintaining a full-time job. So if the channel can grow big enough, I've committed to myself to quit my full-time job and do this full-time, which would mean I could bring significantly more of this style of content. And so to that end, if you want to support independent media, if you think that more people need to hear this message, please consider supporting the channel as a member. It costs less than a coffee per month, and there's a membership link below. I thank you in advance for helping to grow the channel and helping to produce more content important to Canadians.